Hello everybody, in this video I will be painting a House Cawdor gang member for Necromunda. As usual, I start off with a base coat of Chaos Black through a rattle can. And this is then followed by a coat of metallic black, and I do this through an airbrush just to speed up the process a bit. If you don't own an airbrush, you can use a regular brush with it as well. Next, I'm going to wash all the parts that are going to be metallic using Nuln oil. Once the Nuln oil has dried, I dry brush all the metallic parts using gunmetal. To reinforce the metallic effect a little bit, I then apply a dry brush in a top-down manner using silver. Next I use rust streaks and I put this on the metallic parts a little bit, and I use this pure, and this is then followed by thinning it down using white spirit. Do this in a well ventilated room. The white spirit can give you a horrible headache. Then I make a mixture of 1 part shadow gray and 2 parts magic blue, and I block in all the blue cloth parts. Later on, whilst I was painting the skin, I found that especially the headpiece was quite difficult to paint around. So if you don't feel comfortable doing that, paint the skin in first. Next, using anthracite grey, I painted the boots. Then both the blue cloth and the boots are washed using Nuln oil. As you can see, I used quite a lot of Nuln oil to make sure there's a nice dark, deeper tone on the model. I then made a mixture of anthracite grey and dead white in a 4:1 ratio, and I apply rough highlights to the boots. I make sure I stay away from the recesses and just basically block in the larger parts on the boots. Then I add 1 part dead white to this mixture, and I'm gonna apply a fine highlights to the edges. Next, I made a mixture of 1 part shadow gray and 2 parts magic blue, and I'm going to start and build up the blue cloth. I stay away from the deeper recesses, and basically I just paint up all the higher parts and the most outer parts of the model. Then I add 1 part wolf grey to this mixture, and since we created a nice outline of where the light will fall on the model in the previous stage, I now start building up these highlights from the previous stage, and I make sure I leave a little bit of them visible. Next, using dark flesh tone, I block in the skin. And like I mentioned before, the head was so tricky that I couldn't get that on camera. So I'm just showing the hands in this video. I then made a mixture of 1 part old copper and 1 part Victorian brass, and I painted in the golden parts on the model. This was mainly on the base and just the 1 ring on the weapon. Then I washed these parts using Airbrush Earthshade. Back to the blue, I made a mixture of 1 part shadow gray and 2 parts magic blue and 2 parts wolf gray, and I continued reinforcing the highlights. Again, using the same method, leaving little bits of the previous layers visible, just building the color up to where the most light would fall on the model. Next I added 1 part bone white to this mixture, and I repeated the process. Then I made a mixture of 4 parts yellow olive and 1 part shadow gray, and I blocked in all the green cloth parts on the model. I was careful not to hit the blue parts, and on the deepest recesses where the blue and the green is touching each other, it's not that big of a deal if you don't completely color it in, because next I'm going to apply a wash of Airbrush Earthshade, and if you miss a little spot, this will cover that spot. And again, I used it quite heavily. Then I went back to the same mixture as before, 4 parts yellow olive and 1 part shadow gray, and I basically did the same thing as with the blue cloth. I painted in all the raised areas and the most outer sides of the model, just staying away from the deepest recesses. Then by adding 1 part stonewall gray to the mixture, I started highlighting these colors up, again leaving parts of the previous layer visible and going to where the light would fall on the model. I then added another part stonewall gray, and I repeated this process. By making a color gradually lighter, you can paint in light effects in the actual highlighted areas as well. I then add 1 part white to the mixture, and now by staying on the most raised areas and on the absolute outer side of the model, I paint in an edge highlight, but it's not super thin because it's going to be followed by another edge highlight. So for the final edge highlight, I add 2 more parts white to the mixture. And now I stay on the absolute edges of the model and the most raised areas. I then used pure Victorian brass and I highlighted the golden parts on the model. And this is then followed by a subtle highlight of silver. Next, using Seraphim Sepia, I wash these parts. This helps to enhance the golden effect. The silver doesn't look like gold, obviously, and by applying a thin coat of sepia, the silver will get a more gold-like appearance. And then I started painting the rest of the skin, and I made a mixture of 4 parts tan and 1 part stone wool gray, and I just went over all the dark flesh stone, just blocked it in again. The dark flesh stone is purely acting as a base for this color to sit on. I then added 1 part pale flesh to this mixture, and I started building up highlights. With this first highlight, you can nearly paint in everything except for the deepest recesses or areas where you want to have a shadow later on. For the next highlight, I added 2 more parts pale flesh to the mixture, and now I'm going to more accurately highlight the previously created light effects, and again staying away from the recesses and building up the color towards the areas where light would fall. And for the final highlight, I added 3 more parts of pale flesh. And now, staying purely on the outside, I finish the skin tones off. Next, I went to paint all the leathery straps on the model, and I used earth for this. I also blocked in the hair and the bone sheath the model had in his left hand. Then, using Agrax Earthshade, I washed all these parts except for the hair. Then I went back to earth and I apply a first highlight to all the straps on the model. I try and leave a little bit of the shaded areas visible on the larger parts, and on the smaller parts I just go from a top-down manner and block them in, leaving the recesses untouched. Next, I make a mixture of 1 part earth and 2 part khaki, and I'm going to repeat this process, but now leaving more shaded areas visible. So working towards the light and towards the edges of the parts. For the next highlight, I then add 2 parts bone white to this mixture, and I go and reinforce the previous highlight. Again, in an ever decreasing area, I'm painting, leaving previous layers visible and just carefully building up the color towards the light. And for the final highlight, I add 2 parts dead white to this mixture, and I repeat this process, but now really thin lines on the outer edges and on the top side of the model. Next, using khaki, I paint the candle and the rope on the model. As far as the candle goes, this is purely a base coat for the later color that I'll be painting on, so I'm not gonna bother doing anything with that right now. For the rope, I'm going to wash it with Agrax Earthshade. Once that's dry, I take pure khaki again and I highlight the ropes. And as usual, I stay away from the recesses by just touching it carefully on the most raised areas of the rope. I then make a mixture of 1 part bone white and 2 parts dead white, and I paint the candle in this color. Then I add 2 parts dead white and I carefully start highlighting the candle. I didn't want to have a high contrast on the candle because candles just don't have high contrast when they're burning. So this comes down to nearly painting the entire candle again, just leaving the deepest recesses untouched. And this is then followed by a next highlight of pure white, staying on the edges and just painting in the melting wax on the side of the candles. Using sun yellow, I paint the flame on the candle. And then using hot orange, I from roughly 60%, I paint roughly 60% of the candle from the top to the bottom. And with a little bit of bloody red, I just tip the tip of the flame, and that finishes up the candle as well. Whilst I was using the white, I painted in the lenses on the goggles, and I now glaze these using light red. I went over them 2 times to get a nice color effect on the lenses. Onto the hair, I made a mixture of 1 part earth and 1 part desert yellow, and I painted roughly all the hairs again, just staying away from the recesses. There's a little strap on the top of his head, and I painted this after I finished the hairs. By adding 2 parts desert yellow, I now build up a highlight in the hair, staying away from the deeper parts on the actual hair pieces. And I finish this off using pure desert yellow, just staying on the top of the head, not going towards the side or the bottom. Then there was the bone left to paint, so I highlighted it using earth. I then made a mixture of 1 part earth and 1 part bone white, and I build up this previous highlight, again staying away from the recesses. And this is then followed by a next highlight of pure bone white. And after this, I made a mixture of 1 part bone white and 1 part dead white, and I reinforced this highlight, what I'm applying right now, but I completely forgot to film that. And once that's done, and after a coat of varnish, this is the end result of the model. So I hope you liked this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe if you want to. Dislike if you want to as well, but please let me know what you didn't like about the video so I can improve on that. So once again, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.